I was 19 years old, with a backpack holding 3 changes of clothes and exactly $40 in my pocket, when I signed the paper that changed my life forever. Everyone thought I had lost my mind. The man who sold it to me could barely hide the smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, like he felt sorry for me, but also a little relieved. The station had been sitting there for 28 years, with nobody wanting it, and now a girl who looked like she hadn't slept in a week was handing over the last $40 she had in the world for it. I understood how it looked. I didn't care. The building was in ruins. The roof had caved in at 3 separate points, and through those gaps small trees had grown up toward the light until their crowns broke through into the open sky, so that the station seemed to be breathing green from the inside out. The brick walls, deep red under decades of Georgia humidity, were wrapped in wisteria and kudzu so thick you could barely find the original mortar between the courses. The iron arches above the platform entrance were almost completely consumed by rust, that particular orange-brown of southern iron that has been wet and dry and wet again for longer than most people have been alive. The old oak platform boards had rotted through in places, soft as wet cardboard underfoot, and through the gaps I could see the red Georgia clay below, bright as a wound. And there on the tracks, half buried in the tall grass and the creeping vines that had swallowed the rails, was the locomotive. I had never stood next to a locomotive before that day. Nothing prepares you for the scale of one, even rusted, even tilted slightly on rails that the earth had been slowly swallowing for nearly 3 decades, even draped in moss and trumpet vine, and what looked like an entire ecosystem of ferns growing from the crevices in the iron. Even like that, it was enormous. 3 passenger cars stretched behind it, their wooden sides gone silver-grey with age, their windows long empty of glass, Spanish moss hanging from the window frames in long grey curtains that swayed in the afternoon heat. The whole train looked less like a machine and more like something the forest was in the process of digesting, slowly and without any particular hurry. I stood there looking at all of it, and felt something I still have trouble putting into words. Not despair, not panic. Something closer to recognition, like finding a place you have dreamed about without knowing it was real. But let me tell you how I got there, because this story doesn't start at the station. It starts a long time before that, in a house on the east side of a small town in Georgia, where a little girl was learning day by day that she did not belong anywhere. My father died when I was 5. I don't have many memories of him, just fragments the way early childhood memories always are, incomplete and vivid at the same time. I remember the smell of machine oil on his hands. I remember that he would close his eyes when he heard a train whistle in the distance, the way some people close their eyes during a piece of music they love. And I remember the last time he held me, telling me that one day he was going to show me something very special. He didn't get the chance. 3 weeks later, he was gone. My mother and I were alone together for a few years after that. Those years were hard, but they were ours. Then she met Derek. I was 8 years old when he walked through our front door for the first time, carrying a gas station bouquet of carnations and wearing a smile that never once reached his eyes. My mother thought she had found a second chance. I thought there was something wrong with that man, but I was 8 years old, and nobody asks children for their opinion about things like that. They married when I was 9, and that was when I understood that I had lost my mother too, not to death, but to a version of herself I didn't recognize anymore. Derek didn't yell at me. He didn't hit me. He did something worse. He erased me. When I walked into a room, he would leave it. When I spoke at dinner, he would continue whatever conversation he was having as though I hadn't made a sound. When my mother asked if he had seen me come home, he would say he hadn't noticed. For years I thought I had done something wrong, some specific and nameable thing that I could fix if I could just figure out what it was. It took me a long time to understand that it wasn't about anything I had done. It was about what I represented. I was the daughter of the man who had come before him. I was the living proof that my mother had loved someone else first, and that he would never forgive. My mother got sick when I was 16. It came fast and brutal, the kind of illness that arrives without warning and takes everything in a short time. In her last months, she would hold my hand and say she was sorry with her eyes, without being able to say out loud what we both knew, that she was leaving me alone with him. When she passed, I was 17 years old, and Derek looked at me for the first time in years with an expression that I understood immediately. It wasn't grief. It was calculation. He didn't throw me out. That would have been almost kind. Instead, he let me stay but made sure I understood the terms every single day. My food was separated in the refrigerator with a sticky note that had my name on it. My bathroom was the small half bath at the back of the house where the faucet dripped constantly. When he had people over, I was introduced as my late wife's daughter, without a name, without a context. I slept in a room that was really a storage space he had partially cleared out, and there was a box of my mother's things, leaning against the wall outside my door, that he had never thrown away and never allowed me to open. I had been working since I was 16, first at a grocery store, then cleaning a hair salon before it opened each morning. I saved every dollar I could, because I knew that one day I was going to need to leave. I didn't know where, I didn't know how, but I knew I needed something in my hand when the moment came. By the time I was 19, I had saved $260. It was my entire world, folded inside an envelope I kept under the mattress. It was a Thursday afternoon in late March when everything began to change. I was walking home from work, feet aching, the Georgia heat still heavy even at that hour, when I saw a handwritten flyer stapled to a telephone pole on the corner 2 blocks from Derek's house. The paper was cheap copy paper, already curling at the edges from the humidity, and the handwriting was slow and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who takes their time. It read, "Historic Railroad Station, deed included $40, serious inquiries only, call the number below." I stopped in front of that flyer for a long time. $40, a railroad station, deed included. It was obviously a mistake or a joke or a sign that the property had some catastrophic problem I wasn't seeing. I took a photo of it with my phone and kept walking, but that night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark of my storage room turned bedroom looking at the photo and thinking about something my mother used to say my father believed. She said he always told her that the best opportunities in the world were the ones everybody else had given up on, that the value was always exactly where nobody else was looking. The next morning, I called the number. The voice that answered was old, a little rough, with that particular texture of someone who has lived long and spent a lot of that time outdoors. The man said his name, Earl. He said the flyer had been up for nearly a month, and I was the first person to call. He asked if I wanted to come see the place before making any decisions, said he didn't want to hand it over to somebody who didn't know what they were getting into. I met Earl that Saturday morning at the end of a dirt access road off the county highway that I had driven past 100 times without ever noticing. He was a man in his mid-70s, not tall but with a straightness to his posture that made him seem larger, with hands that were enormous and calloused and deeply lined, the hands of someone who had done physical work for most of their life. He wore a clean white short-sleeved shirt and dark trousers despite the heat, and a battered canvas hat that had been washed so many times it had lost whatever color it originally was. He shook my hand with a firm, brief grip and looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't read. Not unkind, but searching, the way you look at someone you're trying to place. We walked down the access road for about 10 minutes, the live oaks closing in on both sides, Spanish moss brushing our shoulders in the places where the canopy came low. The morning light came through the leaves in fragments, gold and green and shifting. Then the road curved and the world opened up. The station was there. It was larger than I had imagined, much larger. The main building was 2 stories of deep red brick with stone detailing along the roofline. The brick darkened unevenly by decades of Georgia weather into a patchwork of red and brown and near black that was somehow more beautiful than it would have been clean. The iron arches above the platform entrance were extraordinary even in their decay, the ironwork still showing the original decorative scrollwork beneath the rust in places where I looked closely. The roof had failed at 3 points, and through those openings the trees had grown, so that the building appeared to be held together partly by brick and mortar and partly by the vegetation that had moved in after the last human left. Wisteria had taken the south wall almost entirely, and in the March morning it was beginning to bloom, purple clusters hanging against the dark brick in a way that made the whole wall look like something painted rather than grown. And in front of it all, on the rails that the Bermuda grass and the privet had nearly swallowed, was the locomotive. I had already seen it from a distance when we came around the curve, but coming closer was different. The thing was massive, even tilted slightly, even rusted through in places, even draped in trumpet vine and resurrection fern. It commanded the space in a way I felt physically. The 3 passenger cars behind it were in the same condition, their wooden sidings silvered and splitting. The window frames hung with Spanish moss, a colony of chimney swifts nesting in the space where the ceiling of the second car had partially collapsed. Between the second and third car, a young cedar had grown up between the rails and pushed through the coupling connection, spreading its branches over both cars in a way that seemed deliberate, like the tree had decided to hold them together. Beyond the station building, through a gap in the live oaks, I could see the glint of a tidal creek moving slow and brown through the marsh grass, the way coastal Georgia water always moves, like it has nowhere it needs to be. I stood there looking at all of it until Earl said, quiet and without any pressure in his voice, "Go ahead and look around as much as you want." We went in through the main entrance, the double doors long gone, the opening framed by wisteria that had grown across the top of the arch like a curtain. Inside, the main waiting room was vast, with a ceiling that had been beautiful once and was still extraordinary now. The original pressed tin intact in the sections where the roof had held, the pattern of it barely visible under decades of grime, and the staining from water that had come through the failed sections. The floor was the original wide plank heart pine, dark and dense and holding in the places where it hadn't been damaged by water, and through the gaps in the damaged sections, the ground below showed red clay and a ground cover of resurrection fern that had migrated inside and taken hold wherever there was enough light. Afternoon light came through the empty window openings and the holes in the roof in columns so thick with dust particles and floating seeds that they looked almost solid, like something you could hold. The original ticket windows were still there on the north wall, the iron grille intact on both of them. The painted lettering above them faded but legible. The waiting benches were gone, but the iron hardware where they had been bolted to the floor remained, rows of it running down the center of the room like the ghost of an order that no longer existed. Earl stayed near the entrance while I moved through the space. He didn't say anything. He let me take my time. When I turned back to him and asked why $40, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because $40 makes it a sale and not a gift. I don't want to give it away. I want whoever ends up with this place to have chosen it." I asked if no one else had shown any interest in a month. He said I was the first to call, that people had seen the flyer and turned away, that the station had a particular reputation in the county, not for being haunted, but for being a reminder of something the area preferred not to think about, a time when this part of Georgia had a rail line running through it that connected small communities to each other and to the city. And when that line was shut down, it took the jobs and the foot traffic and the sense of connection with it, and people found it easier to pretend the station wasn't there than to reckon with what its abandonment meant. I thought about my $260 under the mattress in Derek's storage room, thought about how if I spent 40 of them, I'd have 220 left, which was nothing, and also everything I had. I thought about the flyer with its slow, deliberate handwriting and Earl's voice on the phone. I thought about my father closing his eyes when he heard a train whistle. I said I wanted to buy it. Earl looked at me for a long moment with that expression I still couldn't fully read. Then he gave a single slow nod, the kind that means a decision has been confirmed that was made some time before this particular conversation. We signed the paperwork on a Monday afternoon at the county recorder's office. The clerk looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity that I recognized well. Then she looked at Earl with the unspoken question of whether the old man was in full possession of his faculties. Earl signed without changing his expression. I signed with a hand that was not quite steady, and the feeling of stepping off a ledge I couldn't see the bottom of. That same evening I went back to Derek's house, put my 3 changes of clothes into my backpack, took the envelope with my remaining $220, and picked up the box of my mother's things that had been leaning against the hallway wall for 2 years. Derek was in the living room watching television. He didn't say a word as I walked past him. I didn't say a word either. I pulled the front door closed behind me and felt something release in my chest, like a hand that had been squeezing for years had finally let go. I slept that first night on the heart pine floor of the main waiting room, with my backpack as a pillow, listening to the night sounds of coastal Georgia outside the empty windows, the frogs and the insects, and somewhere in the distance the movement of water through the marsh. There were mosquitoes and there was humidity, and the floor was hard against my bones. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, the place I was in was mine. I woke the next morning to the light coming through the empty windows and the roof openings in those thick golden columns. The resurrection fern on the floor lit up bright green wherever a shaft of light touched it. I lay there on my back for a while, looking up at the pressed tin ceiling and the pieces of blue sky showing through the gaps, and I thought that this place had been waiting a long time. Not necessarily for me, but for someone who wouldn't walk away. The first days I focused on making the space livable enough to survive in. I cleared a section of the old station master's office at the back of the building where the roof was intact and set up a sleeping pad I bought with part of my remaining money. I found a hand pump at the back of the property that still drew water from a shallow well, the water cold and clean with that faint mineral taste of Georgia groundwater. I bought a small camp stove and a single pot and began cooking my meals in what had been the first-class waiting room, the empty arched windows looking out onto the platform and the locomotive beyond, live oak branches moving slowly in the coastal breeze. Earl appeared on the third morning. He came up the access road carrying a paper grocery bag that had inside it a pound of coffee, a bag of grits, dried beans, canned tomatoes and a box of crackers. He set the bag down without ceremony and said, "This is not charity. Think of it as a deposit on whatever this place is going to become." I didn't know what to say to him in that moment. I made coffee on the camp stove, and we sat on the edge of the platform with our cups while the morning light moved across the station building and across the locomotive, and the slow water of the tidal creek glinted through the oaks. I asked him how long the station had been closed. He looked at the locomotive for a moment before he answered. Said the last train had come through 28 years ago. That when the line was shut down, a lot of people left the area looking for work elsewhere. That he had stayed. That most everyone who had stayed knew where the station was but had found ways to not come out here. I asked if he had worked for the railroad. He said he had. Said he had started as a section hand at 19, working on the track maintenance crews, and had worked his way up over the years to locomotive fireman, then to engineer on a short-haul freight run that served 3 counties before the line was consolidated and the run eliminated. Said he had worked for the Central of Georgia for 22 years in total. There was something in his voice when he said that, a quality I recognized without being able to name it right away. It was the voice of someone describing a love that ended badly and was never entirely resolved. I asked him what the locomotive was called. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't interpret, said engines had numbers, not names, but that the crews always found ways to name the ones that were theirs. Said that one had been called the Georgia Rose, and that nobody remembered anymore exactly why, but that the name had stuck through 3 different crews and 2 decades of service. I went to sleep that night with the name in my head. Georgia Rose. I looked out the small window of the station master's office toward the platform and could make out the dark shape of the locomotive against the lighter darkness of the sky, and it seemed even larger seen that way, at night, in silhouette. In the days that followed, I began to explore the station more carefully, moving through the spaces I hadn't yet entered, each one a different negotiation between the building and the decades of Georgia weather and wildlife that had moved in after the people moved out. In the old freight room, a black rat snake had taken up residence in the corner near the door and watched me enter with calm yellow eyes and no apparent concern, as if I were the guest and it the established tenant. In the baggage room, the floor had failed entirely in one section, and below it I could see the red clay and the root systems of a water oak that had found its way under the foundation. But it was the basement that changed everything. The station had a basement. I found it by accident, moving a heavy wooden crate in the station master's office to sweep beneath it. The crate was sealed and wouldn't open, but when I dragged it to one side, I saw that there was a trapdoor in the floor. The wood of the trapdoor was swollen with moisture and resisted, but the hinge worked, and when I pulled it open, there was a wooden staircase descending into darkness. I went down with my phone flashlight and stood on the bottom step, looking at what was there. The space was surprisingly dry, with a ventilation gap near the ground on the exterior wall that kept the air moving. There were wooden shelves on 3 walls, holding wooden crates and canvas mail sacks, most of them rotted through, and in the center of the space there was a roll-top desk and a wooden chair and a kerosene lamp with a cracked chimney. I came fully down the stairs and moved to the desk. On top of it there was a metal document box with a brass clasp. The clasp was corroded but not locked, and when I opened it, I found papers. Folded documents, some of them brittle at the edges, letters in envelopes with the stamps yellowed and fused, photographs printed on that matte paper stock of another era. I picked up the first photograph carefully. It had been taken on the platform of the station itself. I could see the iron arch in the background. 2 young men in railroad work clothes stood in front of the locomotive, both of them grinning at the camera. The one on the left was lean, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead, and there was something about the way he held his head slightly tilted that sent a feeling through my chest I couldn't immediately explain. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written 2 names and a year. Earl and Thomas, 1997. 19. I had to sit down on the bottom step of the stairs because my legs wouldn't hold me. Thomas was my father's name. I sat in that basement with the photograph in both hands for a time I cannot measure. The flashlight on my phone lit the 2 young men grinning in front of the Georgia Rose, and I looked at the one on the left, trying to find in him the fragments I had been carrying since I was 5 years old. The smell of machine oil, the closed eyes at the sound of a train whistle, the voice that promised to show me something special one day. Earl had known who I was from the moment I called. He hadn't sold me the station by accident. The flyer on the telephone pole 2 blocks from Derek's house was not a coincidence. The $40, exactly the amount a 19-year-old girl with almost nothing could put together, was not a random price. He had found me, and he had waited until he believed I was ready to be found. I climbed the stairs, crossed the waiting room with the photograph in my hand, walked out through the main entrance and down toward the platform. The afternoon was turning golden, that particular late-day Georgia light that makes everything look like it's being seen for the last time and the first time simultaneously. Earl was sitting on the edge of the platform where he always sat, his canvas hat in his lap, looking at the Georgia Rose on the tracks. He heard my footsteps and turned, saw the photograph, and said nothing. I sat down beside him and placed the photograph between us on the warm planks of the platform. We both looked at it for a long moment. Then I asked him why he hadn't told me before, and he said, "Because some things need to be found, not handed over. Your father knew that better than anyone." Earl stayed quiet for a long time after I said that, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, that is full of things finding their order before becoming words. The afternoon light was sliding from gold into something deeper, and the tidal creak through the oaks was catching the last of it in slow bronze flashes. The Georgia Rose on the track seemed larger in the fading light, a dark and patient shape that the rust and the vines had not diminished. He took the photograph from the platform between us with a care that told me everything about what it meant to him, held it for a long moment with the expression of someone visiting a place that exists only in memory now. Then he said that Thomas was the best engineer who had ever worked that line. Said it wasn't his opinion, it was the consensus of everyone who had known the man, that Thomas had a relationship with the machines that went beyond technical, beyond professional, that he listened to an engine the way a doctor listens to a chest, hearing things other people couldn't hear, knowing what a sound meant before he could explain how he knew. I asked how they had met. Earl said Thomas had come to the railroad at 22, young and without connections in the industry, knowing almost nothing about locomotives, but learning faster than anyone Earl had seen in 30 years of watching new men come in. Said within a year Thomas knew more about the Georgia Rose than engineers who had been running her for a decade, that they had worked together for 11 years, that they had been the kind of friends the world offers you once if you are fortunate, and that sometimes you don't recognize that kind of friendship while you are inside it, only when you look back. His voice changed slightly when he said that, went quieter, went deeper. He told me Thomas had a particular habit before every run, that he would put his hand flat against the side of the locomotive before climbing into the cab, the way you might greet someone, that the other crews noticed and gave him a hard time about it, teasing him for treating the engine like a person. And that Thomas always said the same thing in response, that anything built to carry people deserved to be treated with respect. Earl said that with a small smile, the kind that surfaces when a memory is still good despite everything that came after it. I asked what had happened to my father. My mother had never spoken about him after Derek came into our lives, and before that, I had been too young to ask the right questions. I knew he had died, knew it was an accident, but the details were a blank space I had learned not to try to fill, because there was nothing more painful than standing in front of a blank space you cannot complete. Earl said Thomas had died in a work accident, that there was a section of track on the county line that had been flagged for maintenance for months, and that the company had deferred the repairs 3 times for budget reasons. That on a wet night in November, my father was at the throttle of the Georgia Rose when the rail gave way on a curve, that he had managed to apply the emergency brake in time to keep the train from going fully off the embankment, pulling every passenger car back from the edge, that he had not survived. I didn't cry right then. I think my mind needed time to translate what those words meant, to move the information from fact into weight. My father had died keeping people safe. The company had known the track was failing and had chosen not to fix it. And Thomas had kept running that line anyway, because there were families depending on that train at every stop between here and the city. Earl was quiet for a time after saying it. Then he said that on the night of the accident, he had been at the station waiting for the train to come in, because it was his shift to receive. That when the minutes passed and the Georgia Rose didn't appear at the time the schedule said she would, he knew. Said there was a quality to the silence that night that was different from every other silence he had waited through in 22 years of railroad work. That he had stood on this platform for hours, in the rain waiting for news he already knew the shape of. And that when the confirmation came, he had walked into the engine shed and sat down on the floor against the wall and had not been able to get up for a very long time. He said he had never been able to climb into a locomotive cab again after that night. 3 months after the accident, the line was shut down. Earl said he never knew whether the closure was a consequence of what happened or whether it had already been decided before Thomas died. Said that was never made clear. That a lot of people left the area in the following years, and those who stayed found ways to not think about what the station represented. That he had stayed because his whole life was rooted here, but that the years of living close to an abandoned place that held everything he had lost had been heavy in a way that didn't get lighter, only more familiar. I asked why he had looked for me now. Why not years ago, when I was younger, when I was growing up without knowing anything about my father? He said he had tried. That when I was around 7 or 8, he had gone to the house where my mother and I were living, wanting to tell her about Thomas, wanting to keep some connection to his friend's memory through the daughter Thomas had left behind. That my mother had received him once politely and then had not answered the door again. That after a while there was a man answering who said there was nobody by that name at the residence. Derek had cut that thread too, the way he had cut so many others. Earl said that a little more than a year ago he had found my name and current address through a contact at the county records office because there was an old estate filing that listed Thomas's effects and named Earl as a witness, and that filing also referenced a surviving daughter. He said he had sat in his truck at the end of Derek's street for an afternoon, watching the house from a distance, trying to understand what he was dealing with before he approached, that he had seen me leave in the early morning with a work bag and the walk of someone carrying a weight that was not physical, that he had understood everything he needed to understand that afternoon. So he had waited, had made the flyers by hand because his handwriting was slow now, and he didn't trust himself to make them look right any other way, had put one on the telephone pole he knew I passed every day because he had followed me at a careful distance for a week first, not in a frightening way but with the patience of someone who needed to be certain before acting, had waited for me to call. And when I called, he had recognized my voice immediately, said I had Thomas's voice, the rhythm of it, the way I paused before asking a question. I looked at the tidal creek going dark through the oaks and thought that sometimes the things people call destiny are not abstract forces working on your life from a distance. Sometimes destiny is in its mid-70s, wearing a faded canvas hat and carrying a bag of groceries with the patience of a man who learned to respect the schedule of things that cannot be rushed. I asked what else was in the document box in the basement. Earl said there were things of Thomas's, that when the line closed and the station was locked, he had gone down to the basement and gathered everything Thomas had left in the crew room, the letters that were never sent, the logbooks, the photographs, that he had also put some of his own things down there because he couldn't bring them home and couldn't bring himself to throw them away, that he had locked the trap door and kept the key for 28 years without knowing what to do with it, that when he found me he had deliberately unlatched it a few days before I moved into the station, knowing I would explore the place and find the box. Some things need to be found, not handed over. Handed. That night, I went back down to the basement with a proper flashlight Earl had left in the grocery bag, as if he had known I would need it. I sat in the wooden chair at the roll-top desk and began going through the crates on the shelves one by one, with the care of someone handling something that matters. There were logbooks with the entries my father had made on every run, date, departure time, arrival time, passenger count, track observations. His handwriting was small and even, leaning slightly right, and in the margins of the logbooks there were small pencil sketches of engine parts and gear assemblies that he had drawn without apparently noticing he was doing it, the way a hand moves on its own when the mind is somewhere else. There were letters that had never been sent, some to old friends, some to colleagues who had left the area. There was one addressed to my mother that I folded back into its envelope after reading the first 3 lines because I needed more time and more strength for that one. There was a canvas mail sack that held Earl's own things, a worn leather wallet with a railroad union card inside it, dated 1979, a folded copy of the employee schedule from the station's last operating week, a small New Testament with a broken spine, and Thomas's name written on the inside cover in a handwriting that was not my father's. Earl had been the one to write Thomas's name there. I sat with that for a long time, and there was a different kind of book at the back of the bottom shelf, not a logbook, a composition notebook with a blue marbled cover, the kind sold at every drugstore in America, with a strip of electrical tape reinforcing the spine. On the cover, in my father's small, even handwriting, a single line, "The Station Project." I opened it with hands that were not steady. 41 pages, sketches of the facade restored, hand-drawn floor plans showing how the internal spaces could be reorganized, cost estimates in pencil with dollar figures from 28 years ago that were poignant in their imprecision, a handwritten list of contacts at the Georgia Historic Preservation Division and the National Register of Historic Places, pages of notes about the history of the Central of Georgia Railway and its role in connecting rural communities across the state. And at the back of the notebook, 4 pages in a slightly different hand, faster and less careful, that looked as though they had been written at one sitting. My father had written that the station was not just a building. It was the memory of a time when small communities in Georgia had a future, when people in rural counties were connected to each other and to the city, when a working person could take pride in what they did, because what they did moved people and moved stories. He had written that the abandonment of the rail lines was the abandonment of a promise made to those communities, that he intended to spend the next years of his life working to restore the station, to make it a living museum of Georgia railroad history, a gathering place for the community, a building the county could recognize as part of its identity instead of pretending it wasn't there. The last line of those 4 pages read, "If I don't get to finish this, let whoever finds this notebook finish it for me." I closed the notebook and rested my forehead against the cover and stayed that way for a while. The flashlight threw long shadows across the shelves. From upstairs came the sound of the night wind moving through the empty window openings. That sound I had already learned to recognize as the station breathing. I was 19 years old. I had $220, no technical training, and no experience restoring anything. But I had the notebook, and I had Earl. And I had the stubbornness of someone who had inherited it from a father she barely knew, but who appeared to have been made of the same material. I started the next morning. Earl became a daily presence. He arrived early, sometimes before I was awake, and I would find him sitting on the platform edge with coffee already made on the camp stove. He knew everything about that station, every structural problem, every story that had happened within those walls. He had contacts across the county, people who had worked the railroad or whose parents had, and some of them began showing up on weekends to help. Not for money, because there was no money. They came because the station meant something to them too. A grandfather who had been a section foreman, a woman whose father had been a Pullman porter on the line before it was consolidated, a retired school teacher whose family had arrived in Savannah on a Central of Georgia train in 1951, and who had never forgotten the feeling of stepping onto this platform for the first time. The station was becoming, slowly, a place of collective memory that the community had been carrying without knowing where to put it. One of the first to appear was a man named Curtis, who had worked in historic masonry restoration for 30 years and who showed up one Saturday with his own tools and the information that he had heard about the project through a church friend, and that he wasn't leaving until somebody gave him real work to do. He spent 3 months on the exterior brickwork, moving section by section with a methodical patience that put any professional contractor I could have imagined to shame. He worked in near silence, with the concentration of someone doing something that matters, and when a section came out particularly well, he would step back 2 paces and look at it with a quiet satisfaction that was genuinely moving to watch. A woman named Josephine came with a cardboard box full of photographs of the station in operation that her grandmother had taken and kept for 50 years without knowing quite why. We sat on the platform one afternoon while she told me the story behind each one, who the people were, what was happening that day, what the waiting room smelled like when it was full of passengers and steam heat. Those stories went into a notebook I began keeping for the museum we were going to build, and Josephine became one of our most dedicated researchers, spending afternoons at the county library going through microfilm archives of old Georgia newspapers looking for any documentation of the railroad's history. I taught myself to write grant applications by studying examples I found online. I took a free cultural management course on my phone during the evenings by the light of a battery lantern. I wrote to preservation foundations, to state arts councils, to historical societies. Most didn't respond. Some responded with rejections. One said it would review the application. I kept writing. It was in the 5th month that the development company appeared. I was working on the exterior south wall, clearing the decades of kudzu growth from the brickwork, when I heard a car on the access road. It was an SUV I didn't recognize, new and clean, in a way that felt wrong against the red dirt of the road. 2 men got out, both in business casual clothes that were too warm for the Georgia spring. One of them carried a clipboard. They said they represented a residential development company that had been monitoring property transactions in the county and had identified this parcel as part of a potential acquisition. They said they had done their research and had found questions around the validity of the original sale, specifically around whether the seller had had clear title to convey, and that their legal team believed there were grounds to challenge the deed transfer. They said they would be willing to discuss a settlement that would allow me to walk away with something rather than nothing when the legal process ran its course. I listened to all of it without speaking. I felt the old familiar sensation from childhood, the one where someone with more apparent power was standing in the space, and I was supposed to become smaller. I was not that person anymore. I told them the deed had been properly recorded at the county office, with all required documentation, verified at the time of transfer, that the title search had been clean, that Earl was a man in full possession of his legal faculties and his property rights, and that any attorney who spent 5 minutes with him would confirm that immediately. I told them if their company believed it had a legal claim, it was welcome to file one, and that in the meantime I was asking them to leave private property. The man with the clipboard looked at me for a moment, with an expression that was trying to recalculate. Then he looked at the station building behind me and at the locomotive on the tracks, and I could see him doing a different kind of calculation, the kind that involves square footage and market rate, and how many units you could put on a parcel this size if the existing structure weren't there. He handed me a business card and said his company hoped I would reconsider before this became complicated. I held the card until their SUV had gone back down the access road. Then I walked to the platform where Earl was sitting and told him what had happened. He listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Your father would have handled that exactly the same way." Then he picked up his coffee cup and took a sip, and that was the end of it, as far as he was concerned. We went back to work. The development company tried twice more. Once through a certified letter from their attorney making a formal settlement offer. Once through a phone call from someone identifying herself as a community liaison who wanted to discuss the historical significance of the property in a way that suggested she believed I didn't understand what I was sitting on. Both times I referred them to the County Historic Preservation Office because by that point I had filed a nomination for the station to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which would provide a level of legal protection that no development company wanted to fight in Georgia. The nomination was accepted 8 months after I filed it. The grant funding came through from the Georgia Historic Preservation Division in the 7th month, a modest amount that covered the most critical structural work, the roof repairs, and the foundation stabilization, with the condition that the station be opened as a cultural space with regular public programming. I read the approval email 4 times before I believed it. Then I went down to the basement, sat in the wooden chair, opened my father's blue composition notebook to the last page, and wrote under the last line he had written, "I am working on it." The restoration took 16 months from the day the funding came through. 16 months of work that sometimes felt unending, of problems that appeared behind every wall we opened, of nights when I was so tired I fell asleep before I intended to. But also 16 months of discoveries, of histories people brought when they came to help, of a community waking up to something it had been storing in the back of its memory without a place to put it. There was a week when we pulled up the damaged flooring in the second-floor gallery and found beneath the subfloor an original mosaic tile installation that nobody had known was there, put in during the station's construction and covered by a renovation sometime in the 1940s. It was a pattern of deep blue and cream, showing a stylized Georgia landscape, the low country marshes, and the long straight lines of the railroad tracks running toward the horizon. We stood and looked at it in silence for a long time. Josephine said she had found no record of it in any of the newspaper archives she had searched, that it was a genuine discovery. Curtis said whoever laid it had been a craftsman of the highest order and had never signed it, and never would have expected anyone to know who they were. We restored the gallery floor around it and left it exposed as the centerpiece of that level. People climb the stairs now just to stand in front of it and are quiet in the way that very old beautiful things make people quiet. There was an afternoon when a man in his late 80s arrived at the station being helped by his granddaughter, moving slowly with a cane, and stood at the edge of the platform, looking at the Georgia Rose for a very long time without speaking. Then he said, in a voice that had gone thin with age, that he had boarded this train for the first time when he was 23 years old, heading to Savannah to take a job at the port, with $40 in his pocket and no certainty of anything. That he had thought at the time that he would come back wealthy and had come back only alive, but that being alive had been enough, that he had not expected to see this place standing again. His granddaughter was crying. I was crying. Earl, who had walked over to stand beside the old man without a word, put his hand briefly on the man's shoulder, and the two of them stood there together looking at the locomotive and didn't need to say anything more. On the last evening before the opening, when everyone had gone home and I was doing a final walk-through alone, I went into the locomotive cab for the first time. The access steps had been reinforced during the restoration, the cab floor stabilized, and inside there were all those original brass and iron instruments that the decades had oxidized but not destroyed, the pressure gauge, the throttle, the brake valve, the reverser. I stood in the cab in the dark, looking at those instruments, and tried to imagine my father's hands on them, his focus, the feeling of the Georgia Rose moving under him and the Georgia landscape going past the windows. I stayed for a long time. Then I climbed down, and before I walked away I put my hand flat against the side of the locomotive, the way Earl had told me Thomas always did. The opening was on a Saturday in October, with that particular quality of Georgia autumn light that is different from any other light, clear and slanted and gold in a way that makes everything look significant. People came from across the county and from neighboring counties, families and individuals and church groups and history enthusiasts, and a crew from a travel publication that had heard about the project through social media. A local television news team set up on the platform. and people who had grown up hearing about the railroad from parents and grandparents who had worked it or traveled on it. People who had never seen the station because it had closed before they were born. Earl spent most of the day on the platform, sitting on the restored original bench, receiving the people who came to talk to him. There were many. He was the living memory of the place in a way nobody else could be, and he spoke to everyone with that patience and quiet that were the marks of him, and his eyes had a light in them that I had not been able to see when I first knew him, and that had been coming on slowly over the months of work. The Georgia Historic Preservation Division has since designated the station as one of the 10 most significant railroad heritage sites in the state. A university partnership is in discussion for an academic archive of Central of Georgia Railway records to be housed here. The Georgia Rose will never run again under her own power, but a foundation has begun raising funds for a static restoration that would bring her back to operational appearance, which is a different thing, but still something. Today the Savannah station, which is what people have taken to calling it, receives visitors from across Georgia and beyond. There is a railroad museum that tells the history of the Central of Georgia and the communities it connected. There is a room dedicated to the workers, the engineers and firemen, and section crews and porters, the men who built and ran the line, with Earl's own story and Thomas's story among them. There is a small cafe in the old first-class waiting room, where on Friday evenings a local jazz quartet plays, and people drink their coffee looking out the restored arched windows at the Georgia Rose on the tracks. There is a school program that has already brought more than 3,000 students from across the region. Earl works at the station every day. At 78, he is the most requested guide on the property, and it is not difficult to find him in some corner of the museum explaining to a group of children how a steam locomotive's firebox works, with that patience and quiet that are the marks of him, and with a light in his eyes that has only grown since the opening day. 2 months ago, a transportation heritage organization approached us about a partnership to explore the feasibility of restoring a short section of the original track and operating the Georgia Rose as a tourist excursion on special dates. The engineering study is ongoing. I don't know if it will happen, but I find myself thinking about what it would be like to stand on this platform on the day the Georgia Rose moves under her own power for the first time in nearly 30 years. And I think about what Earl would do in that moment, whether he would be quiet, the way he always is, or whether he would finally cry, which is what he did not do on the night my father didn't come in. I am 21 years old. I am taking classes in historic preservation and non-profit management at a state university, partly online and partly in person, with a scholarship I obtained through the Preservation Foundation. I live in a small apartment that is mine, paid for by the income the station generates. I don't think about Derek, not because I have resolved what he represented in my life, but because there are things you decide to stop carrying, and that decision has to be remade every day, and every day I make it again. Some nights after closing, I sit on the platform in Earl's spot and look at the Georgia Rose. She is the same machine that was there when I arrived, with the moss removed and the iron treated, but with the marks of time that remained because they are part of what she is. The cedar tree still grows between the second and third car. The tidal creek still moves through the oaks behind the station, catching light in the evenings the way it always has. And sometimes, when it is very quiet, I think I hear a train whistle somewhere in the distance, and I close my eyes for a moment, the way my father used to do. It isn't grief. It's recognition. The story of the Savannah station teaches us that the most abandoned places in the world often hold what is most precious, not in money, not in property value, but in memory and in dignity and in belonging. If this story reached you the way it reaches me every time I walk through those doors, share it with someone who needs to believe that it is possible to start over with nothing, with $40, with a backpack, with nothing but the stubbornness to not walk away. Leave a comment below. Would you have had the courage to buy a place the whole world had given up on without knowing what was waiting inside? I want to read what you have to say.